from Georgia, Ms. Greene.
The gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of this resolution. Being a mother is the greatest gift in the world, and childbirth is a true miracle of God. In 2019, pregnancy centers served roughly 2 million women, men, and youth. They provided services such as medical care, education, mentoring, and material support like diapers, car seats, and clothing. From 2016 through 2020, pro-life pregnancy centers partnered with pregnant women at risk for abortion to save over 800,000 lives. Approximately 75% of women at risk for abortion who view an ultrasound of their baby in the womb at a pregnancy center ultimately make the choice to continue their pregnancy. Merrick Garland calls parents who want to protect their kids from sexual indoctrination in schools domestic terrorists, but refuses to protect facilities that help pregnant women carry their babies from being attacked by far-left extremists. Since the Dobbs decision was leaked in May 2022 alone, approximately 40 churches and 60 pro-life pregnancy centers have been firebombed and vandalized across the country by pro-murder extremists. The range of cost of damages for each attack ranges from less than $100 to more than $250,000. Shameful. Some of the things they have said, they've spray painted on a church in Lansing, Michigan, abort the court, and death to Christian nationalism. Death for Christians that care about our country? I don't think so. They also caused $50,000 in damages in Bethesda, Maryland, setting fire to 3 churches. It's shameful. Jane's Revenge, which is a terrorist group, said if abortion isn't safe, neither are you. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this resolution.
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
I have an amendment at the desk, number 2, printed in the congressional record.
The clerk will designate the amendment, and a point of order is reserved.
The congressional record offered by Mrs. Greene of Georgia.
The gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Taylor Greene, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, before I discuss the details of my amendment, I want to applaud the new Republican majority for giving members the opportunity to offer amendments in a more open process. The People's House has been broken for far too long, and I look forward to working with my colleagues in an open process for the remainder of this Congress. I also want to thank Chairman McMorris Rodgers for her leadership on this issue to put American energy first. I co-sponsored this legislation because I believe it puts America back on track to regain energy independence. This is such an important issue and critical piece of legislation that I believe we cannot stop short. We need to chart a path back to energy independence and ensure President Biden is not able to sell our critical oil supplies to China or any other rogue nations. President Biden used emergency authorities to sell hundreds of millions of barrels of oil to our enemies. My amendment would prevent President Biden from claiming an emergency to further reduce our strategic oil supplies. This is why I filed impeachment articles last Congress against President Biden on the grounds that he endangered, compromised, and undermined the energy security of the United States by selling oil from the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve to foreign nations. President Biden has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the national security of our country. No president in the history of the United States has ordered a liquidation of the SPR on this scale. He sold 40% of our critical oil supply to trick and deceive the American people before the election. Rather than unleashing American energy here at home, he has robbed our country. While President Biden took office in 2021, the SPR contained 638 million barrels of oil. Since then, he has slashed our oil inventory to 371 million barrels. He has decimated the SPR to the lowest level since December 1983, before some members of this body were even born. He shredded the offers from oil companies to resupply the reserve. He gave away 7 million barrels of oil to a communist Chinese state-run energy firm. The CCP had 1.2 billion barrels when Biden took office. They have even more now. Cannot believe our president did that. If we let President Biden continue to run our oil this way, we will have nothing left. This has destroyed America's oil production. President Biden shut down the Keystone XL pipeline, destroying hundreds of thousands of American jobs. President Biden has allowed the least amount of federal land for drilling since the end of World War II. We are now producing 1 million barrels of oil less every day compared to when President Trump was in office. Every country faces national disasters. Where will we get our oil next time we are in crisis? Who will we have to beg to get our oil? China? Iran? The Saudis? Venezuela, like the Biden administration has already done? Or maybe even Russia? President Biden's actions prove an intentional plot to destroy America's oil industry and usher in the climate cult's Green New Deal. My amendment would simply strike the exceptions that Biden used to sell our oil. The American people don't believe that the president should have the authority to declare an emergency for any reason and then sell our oil to our enemies. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I would like to announce that I am reintroducing my bill, the Protect Children's Innocence Act. This bill will stop gender-affirming care on children. It will protect children from the heinous and evil ideology that is grooming kids and making a profit off of horrific surgeries that mutilate their genitals, give them life-altering medications like puberty blockers, hormone therapy that will have permanent damage to their bodies for the rest of their life. Before these kids are even grown up, before they've graduated from high school, before they're old enough to vote, before they're old enough to get a tattoo, ink on their own skin, before they're old enough to join the military, before they're old enough to make adult decisions. This is an important bill that Congress must pass. My bill will charge any person who knowingly performs gender-affirming care on a minor with a Class C felony. It will prohibit all taxpayer-funded gender-affirming care. It will prohibit institutions or higher education from providing instruction on gender-affirming care. There's nothing affirming about lying to children that they can change their gender, because you cannot change your gender. My bill will deem aliens who are determined to have performed gender-affirming care on a minor as ineligible to receive visas or be admitted into the United States. We need to take a strong stand in the United States of America that we do not abuse our children or sexualize them in any way. This is an important bill that must be passed, and I'll give you some examples. In 2021, there was a father in Texas who lost custody of his twin 7-year-old sons because he attempted to stop one of the boys from transitioning his gender. The mother began transitioning the boy when he was only 2 years old and then tried to enroll him in a pediatric gender clinic at age 5. This child, this young boy, needs to be protected, and his father has the rights to do it. But they didn't give him his rights. Last summer, Boston Children's Hospital released videos promoting gender dysphoria and offering sterilization, castration, and mutilation of children. These videos not only explained its genital mutilation surgeries, but they were also promoting these surgeries to kids and their parents. By the way, this is for profit. Also, just recently, Jamie Reed, who worked at one of more than 100 pediatric gender clinics across the United States, publicly came out to discuss the atrocities happening to children at these gender clinics. When a female takes testosterone, the profound and permanent effects of the hormone can be seen in a matter of months. Voices drop, beards sprout, body fat is redistributed, sexual interest explodes, aggression increases, and mood can be unpredictable. One of the side effects includes sterility. As a matter of fact, after only 4 to 5 years of taking testosterone, there have been many young women under the age of 18 that have had to have hysterectomies because of the damage done inside of them. But even more horrific is the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, signed a bill into law to provide refuge for trans kids and their families. This bill will protect trans kids and their families that flee to California from states like Alabama, Texas, or Idaho, or any other state that criminalizing the parents of trans kids for allowing them to receive gender-affirming care. My bill will protect these children and stop a state like California and the monsters and the groomers and the child predators in that state that look to damage them before they ever grow up. There are many states that are working hard to protect kids, but we don't have enough states doing it, and that's why it's the responsibility of Republicans in Congress to protect children. This is imperative. We know what the left is trying to do, and we should have listened to them when they told us. Remember the San Francisco Men's Choir actually singing a song announcing that they're coming for our children? That's a threat that we should not ignore. We've had enough with drag queen shows in elementary schools and middle schools and high schools. We've had enough of drag queens gyrating in front of children in the public square. These groomers and child predators must be stopped because they're sexualizing children for profit in a multi-billion-dollar medical industry that looks to grow and grow. Something must be done to protect the sacred identity of children because God made children. God made all of us, male and female, in his image he made us. And God doesn't make mistakes. I urge every single Republican and members of Congress to co-sponsor my bill, and we must get it passed. This isn't just a Republican issue. This is an issue across the board. All voters agree. I yield back. Thank you. I have the great privilege of serving with many veterans here in Congress, and to them, I'm so grateful for their service. But this is also why I rise in support for this resolution to pull our great military from Syria. I'd like to point out on the official website for the U.S. Department of Defense, when it tells who the Department of Defense is on the About page, it says, "We are your defense." The Department of Defense is America's largest government agency, with our military tracing its roots back to pre-revolutionary times. The department has grown and evolved with our nation. Our mission is to provide the military forces needed to deter war and ensure our nation's security. That is the job of our Department of Defense, not to wage war in foreign lands and foreign countries at the expense of the American taxpayer, but it is to deter war. It is also the role of the Department of Defense to ensure our nation's security, but our border is being ignored. Every single day, our border is invaded by thousands, and over 300 Americans die daily from fentanyl brought into our country by Mexican cartels. I would say those are the enemies we need to be focusing on, not in a country called Syria, where no one in my district ever demands, "Marjorie, we must go to war in Syria." I never hear that request from anyone that voted for me. As a matter of fact, the veterans in my district say we are sick and tired of foreign wars. We are fed up with it, and too many of our American military have died in foreign lands serving their foreign borders and their foreign causes. So I'd like to thank my colleague Matt Gaetz for introducing this resolution, and I strongly encourage all of my colleagues to support it. Thank you.
Is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from the state of Georgia, Ms. Greene.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to remind everyone that Republicans believe in legal immigration. As a matter of fact, we're very proud of our former First Lady, Melania Trump, who immigrated legally to the United States. But there's a clear difference in policies when we talk about border and security for the United States of America. And I think it's very important to remind my colleagues across the aisle what our oath of office actually says. We swear an oath that we will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that is a very important oath to swear, and it's one to uphold. But this is not being upheld. In the past 2 years under this administration, we have seen nearly 5 million people cross our border, and it's unsustainable. As a matter of fact, on Monday, a record was set for border apprehensions. And then just yesterday, that record was defeated because they had even more border apprehensions. 2 records. I don't even know what today is yet. We don't have the numbers, but soon we'll know. But the clear difference between Democrats and Republicans when we talk about border security and we talk about these policies is that Democrats don't serve Americans, they serve migrants, and they serve foreign countries and their borders, but not Americans, American tax dollars, and America's border. As a matter of fact, according to the Border Patrol chief, 5 out of the 9 sectors are out of control and in the hands of the cartels. But yet the most important thing to Democrats across the aisle is attacking the Second Amendment and taking away Americans' guns because they're claiming that'll keep Americans safe from the cartels. That's insanity. Democrats serve migrants so much that they're interested in bringing more into the country. When they talk about hiring more Border Patrol agents, it's because they want Border Patrol agents to be the welcoming committee. But H.R. 2, which I strongly support, hires more Border Patrol agents and gives them bonuses so that they can do the job that they were hired to do, which is to protect our southern border. And by the way, the lives of migrants who are dying nearly every single day as they try to cross our border. You know, it's really interesting. Unfortunately, this administration and Democrats serve migrants so much more than Americans, and it seems that Biden serves any country that's willing to write them a check as long as they make it out payable to the Biden family LLCs. How about that? Title 42 lifts tomorrow.
This time has expired.
Tomorrow. I yield back.
Reserve.
Tennessee reserved. Members are reminded to direct their...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to provide a report to the United States House of Representatives that Americans support impeachment. Last week, I introduced articles of impeachment against 5 people who have abused the power of their positions and provided corruption and disservice to the American people. I introduced articles of impeachment against U.S. Attorney Matthew Graves at the Department of Justice. Matthew Graves refuses to prosecute 67% of the crimes in Washington, D.C., and abuses his office in a political pursuit who he deems political enemies while persecuting people for January 6th, people who just walked through the Capitol. Matthew Graves must be impeached. He should prosecute criminals in Washington, D.C. that commit all kinds of crimes every single day, not care about one day where people have already been arrested and are rotting in jail. Last week, I introduced articles of impeachment against FBI Director Christopher Wray. By turning the FBI into Joe Biden and Merrick Garland's personal police force, Chris Wray has made himself a lackey of the regime. Under Wray's watch, the FBI has intimidated, harassed, and trapped American citizens that have been deemed enemies of the Biden regime. FBI even raided Mar-a-Lago on August 8th of 2022 in an unconstitutional raid of former president's home. FBI whistleblower Garrett O'Boyle told congressional investigators that the FBI created a terrorist threat tag following the Dobbs Supreme Court decision in 2022. O'Boyle confirmed that the purpose of the tag was to target pro-life individuals, and now Wray has weaponized the FBI against his own agents. These brave FBI whistleblowers have been stripped of their salaries and their security clearances simply for coming forward and bravely telling the truth. FBI Director Christopher Wray must be impeached. I introduced articles of impeachment against Attorney General Merrick Garland. Since Merrick Garland took over as Attorney General in March of 2021, he has completely weaponized the Department of Justice. The politicization of the Department of Justice has resulted in the persecution of the left's political enemies and a real two-tier justice system in America. Garland has used the FBI as a personal police force for his boss, Joe Biden. The Department of Justice's persecution of Joe Biden's primary political adversary, Donald J. Trump, is anti-democratic. Raiding the former president's home for legally declassifying documents is a transparent violation of justice. Persecuting a declared candidate for president of the United States is nothing short of election interference. But not only that, from investigating parents who protest their local school boards to going after pro-life activists and Catholics, Merrick Garland must be impeached. What I want to tell the House of Representatives today is a Rasmussen poll was released just last week that 53% of voters in America, Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, support the impeachment of Joe Biden for high crimes and misdemeanors. I introduced articles of impeachment on Joe Biden last week because of the national security crisis at our border. I also introduced articles of impeachment against Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas for failing to do his duties to secure America's border. But he's only doing the bidding of his boss, Joe Biden. At 5 p.m. yesterday, I released a survey simply on my social media asking, do you support impeachment? 8,600 people responded, and that was just from 5 p.m. last night. 77% said yes, they support impeachment. Only 23% oppose. And if anyone's read the comments on my Twitter account, you know for sure it's not just Republicans that follow me. Joe Biden has deliberately compromised our national security by refusing to enforce immigration laws and secure our border. He has allowed nearly 6 million illegals from over 170 countries to invade our country. He has caused approximately 1,700% increase in border encounters in just one sector of our northern border. Under his reign, there have been approximately 1.4 million known gotaways who have evaded U.S. authorities. He has allowed fentanyl, the #1 killer of Americans between ages of 18 and 45, to overwhelmingly flood into our country and kill over 300 Americans every single day. Joe Biden should be impeached. In my district alone, we have had an increase of 350% of fentanyl murders.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
Thank you. Joe Biden must be impeached. I yield.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the president.
Ms. Boebert. Votes aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 215, the nays are 211. The resolution is adopted, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Order, please. Order on the floor. Order on the floor, please. Take your conversations to the back. off the floor. For what purpose does the gentlewoman... Order, please. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida, Mrs. Luna, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I call up the resolution previously noticed.
The clerk will report the...
I yield 3 minutes of my time to the gentleman from Georgia, Representative Greene.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot of things that happen here in Congress, and many of them waste the American people's hard-earned tax dollars. But one of the most outrageous waste of hard-earned tax dollars has been the Russian collusion hoax led by Adam Schiff. Adam Schiff lied to the American people by leading the fake Russian witch hunt against President Trump. He weaponized the House Intelligence Committee to abuse all principles of due process and perpetuate the lies of Russia collusion. And he did that on the media over and over again. His committee conducted approximately 53 interviews during its 2017-2018 Russia probe. These transcripts from the Director of National Intelligence, former Obama Attorney General, former Deputy Attorney General, and the FBI Director, among others, proved that there was zero direct evidence of criminal conspiracy. He not only refused to release these interview transcripts, but he also continued to peddle lies to the American people that Russia interfered in the election. He falsely claimed that Russians offered help. The campaign accepted help. The Russians gave help. And the president made full use of that help when referring to allegations between President Trump and Russia during the 2016 election. In November 2020, he specifically asked Twitter to take action against spreaders of misinformation by removing content that questioned his baseless claims of Russian collusion. The biggest spreader of misinformation was Adam Schiff. As we know, the Mueller report determined there was no criminal collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. Thanks to the Durham report, we know now the entire Russian hoax was bought and paid for by Hillary Clinton and the DNC. During the probe, Schiff also abused his position on the Intel Committee and violated civil liberties by subpoenaing phone records from AT&T and a former Republican colleague on entirely baseless claims. His lies and abuse of power continued during the sham. Hollywood produced January 6th committee witch hunt, where him and his staff doctored a text message between Representative Jim Jordan and former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows to deliberately manipulate information presented to the American people. What a lie. He displayed a graphic of a text message which cut a sentence in half and eliminated the final 2 paragraphs of a detailed legal summary that were contained in the original text message. He did this to peddle more lies to the American people and perpetuate the fake narrative that January 6th was an insurrection, and it was not. And now Adam Schiff is running for Senate.
Gentlewoman yields to...
Thank you.
How much time?
1 minute.
One more minute.
1 more minute. Gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you. And now Adam Schiff is running for Senate in California. Now, California has a lot of things messed up, and California is not the model that the United States needs. As a matter of fact, their government policies are atrocious. So if California decides to send Adam Schiff to Senate, they will be sending a proven liar, and that's what he's aiming to do. Raise money off of being a liar and running for Senate. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlewoman reserved.
The proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 48, printed in House Report 118-142. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 48, printed in House Report number 118-142, offered by Ms. Greene of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 583, the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Greene, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Georgia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to address the House about our National Defense Authorization Act. I just want to remind the House that the National Defense Authorization Act is to fund the Department of Defense, which mission is stated on their website that says their mission is to deter war and protect our nation's national security interest. My amendment is to stop cluster munitions or cluster munitions technology being sold or transferred to Ukraine. Cluster bombs are brutal, inhumane weapons that cause lasting harm to civilians in areas where they are used. When a cluster bomb is deployed, it launches multiple different submissions, which are smaller bombs, in all different directions. The impact radius of cluster bombs varies, but can be as high as several football fields. This causes more widespread destruction, imposing a greater risk to civilian areas, which kills lives. It doesn't save lives. Also, this is an escalation in war. It doesn't deter war. The dud rate varies per bomb, and the dud rate is very important, but they can be typically anywhere between 2% and as high as 40%. These bombs are very unreliable, which makes them very dangerous. Congress even passed a law in 2009 that says the U.S. cannot deploy or transfer cluster munitions with a dud rate higher than 1%, but the president can sign a waiver to bypass this restriction. The Biden administration says that they will not deliver cluster bombs to Ukraine with a dud rate higher than 2.35%. But again, the dud rate is known to be anywhere between 2% and as high as 40%, which means we do not know. Also, over 120 countries are party to the Convention on Cluster Munitions, banning the use, production, transfer, and stockpiling of these weapons, including most of the U.S.'s NATO allies, which is extremely important. And I would like to remind the House, Ukraine is not a NATO member nation. What's next? Chemical or biological weapons? Nuclear weapons? Again, this is an escalation of war that does not belong in our nation's funding bill for the Department of Defense. And with that, I'd like to reserve my time.
Gentlelady reserved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I seek to claim time in opposition to the
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 90 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for 90 seconds.
The reality is Ukraine needs these munitions. Until the West can meet the full demands of the war in Ukraine, these munitions will fill the gaps and ensure a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive and ensure that the Ukrainians are not defenseless. The goal is to give Ukraine the tools it needs to end this war quickly. A protracted war will cost more lives and allow Putin to commit more war crimes. Mr. Speaker, I was in Bucha and stood where some of these crimes were committed. And ultimately, this amendment was not introduced out of concern for civilians. No, this amendment exists because a very few members across the aisle don't seem to mind if the Russians win. And then we would see democracy fall and authoritarianism rise. To ensure Ukrainian victory, we must continue to make these very tough decisions that will end this war and ultimately save lives. And I reserve.
Reserves. Gentlewoman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to yield 1 minute to Ms. Jacobs from California.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Cluster munitions maim and kill indiscriminately, and they often fail to explode on impact, leaving communities littered with dangerous unexploded landmines for years, if not decades. Cleaning them up is expensive and dangerous and takes a long time. And despite claims about the dud rates, we know that when actually used in war, these weapons are unpredictable and kill more civilians than anticipated. That's why I'm opposed to sending cluster munitions to Ukraine. But unlike some of my Republican colleagues, I am a strong supporter of Ukraine. My bipartisan amendment would have banned the transfer of all cluster munitions to any country. And my amendment would have garnered strong support across both parties. But it's clear that this amendment is not about cluster munitions at all. It's about opposing any support to Ukraine. We shouldn't be transferring cluster munitions at all. And the U.S. should join 123 other countries in banning this weapon once and for all and protecting civilians and the children that are maimed and killed by these horrific weapons. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentlelady reserves.
The gentlelady reserves, yes. Thank you.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 90 seconds to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Gentleman's recognized for 90 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment. As a 31-year Army veteran myself and the very grateful dad of 4 sons who've served in Iraq, Egypt, and Afghanistan, I want to reestablish peace through strength as developed by President Ronald Reagan. We must support Ukraine to end criminal Putin's war of aggression as quickly as possible and stop the carnage with Putin's mass murder of innocent civilians. Putin's forces are bombing civilians, kidnapping children to Russia, raping and torturing, and have mined a nuclear plant and blown up a dam. In light of Ukraine's ongoing counteroffensive, which is pitting Ukrainian defenders against dug-in Russian soldiers, cluster munitions are an effective new weapon to Ukraine's arsenal. These weapons will be effective against fortified Russian trenches and concentrated troops of Putin's soldiers who are being sacrificed to death by Putin for his own personal gain of oil, money, and power. The Wall Street Journal has editorialized, Biden is right on the cluster bombs for Ukraine. Cluster bombs are an anti-personnel weapon that ejects multiple bomblets over a large area. They can be very effective to promote the Ukrainian cause. Ukraine isn't seeking to use these bombs against civilians. There is moral distinction between Russia's aggression and Ukraine's use of cluster bombs for defense. These best suited are made to be a trade-off against the risk or for the Ukrainians whose lives are on the line every day. I urge opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentlelady from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 1 minute of my time to the Congressman from Florida, Matt Gaetz.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
It is worth acknowledging the great bipartisan work on this issue with my colleague, Ms. Jacobs, and my colleague, Mr. McGovern, who have been speaking on these issues with clarity for some time. The opponents of the amendment made the principal argument that we have to do anything for Ukraine to win the war. Why not just send the nukes? Like, if the standard is we'll do anything for Ukraine to win, send the tactical nuclear weapons. Of course, we're not going to do that, which means there has to be a line somewhere. And I would hope that we could draw that line somewhere on the humane side of, like, the cluster bomb question. These bombs are indiscriminate. For goodness sakes, we are still cleaning up cluster bombs in Laos because civilians are being killed. So when my colleagues say, well, civilians won't be killed, tell that to the people in the places where cluster munitions have been deployed and people are still being killed, because that is in fact the case. It's also an argument that's been made that, well, the Ukrainians are only going to use this in their own country. How depraved to use these bombs in your own country. That's not a reason to vote against the amendment. It's the reason to vote for it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady reserves. That's 30 seconds. Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 90 seconds to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow.
Gentleman's recognized for 90 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, I fully support Ukraine in its existential fight for freedom and democracy. I've also spent years in this chamber addressing the issue of civilian casualties. In fact, I'm one of the founding co-chairs of the Protection of Civilians in Conflict Caucus. Why? Because I spent the formative years of my life in Afghanistan seeing the results, the horrific results of war, including cluster munitions. But there are times in this chamber that a measure doesn't do what you think it does, but it in fact does the opposite. This measure will not stop the use of clusters in Ukraine. And I have written to the administration, I've asked for clarity, I've asked for assurances and mitigation measures, and I will continue to do that. What this measure will do is play right into pro-Russian, pro-Putin propaganda. It will be twisted and contorted by nefarious actors to say that America doesn't support Ukraine, that Democrats don't support Ukraine, and that is not where we need to be. Because that is the history of this bill. That is the history of those, many of those, who are supporting this bill, who have originated this bill. That is the context from which this bill originates. And that is not where progressive, pro-Ukrainian members should be. And I urge my colleagues to support this, to oppose this measure vociferously. I yield back.
Gentleman yields.
We reserve.
Gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you,
30
Mr.
seconds
Speaker.
remaining.
Thank you. Again, I urge the House to pass this amendment. Our National Defense Authorization Act is for the funding of the Department of Defense. It's for our nation, for the United States of America. And there should be no funding for a foreign war. There should be no weapons sent that increases war. As a matter of fact, that leaves bombs behind for generations to come. That hurts the Ukrainian people. And for anyone to say that this must be done to help the Ukrainian people doesn't care about the innocent Ukrainian lives that will be killed for years to come from these cluster munitions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge the House to pass my amendment.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized. He has 1 minute remaining.
Well, we hear a lot about humanity here. Let's put the facts in front of that. The Ukrainians are firing as many artillery shells in 2 days than we produce in a month. They will run out. They will be defenseless. And if you are suddenly now worried about civilians, watch what Putin has already done. Raped, murdered, tortured innocent civilians, targeted civilians, and if there are no artillery shells to defend them, he will go unheeded. Then you will see inhumanity that we have not seen since the Second World War. Vote against this amendment.
Yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Georgia. Those in favor?
From Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to again strike funding out of the National Defense Authorization Act. The National Defense Authorization Act is an important funding bill for the United States of America, not for any other country. And the American people are fed up and tired of the hard-earned tax dollars that they pay to our government being spent in foreign lands and foreign countries for foreign causes and foreign people. To be against funding for war is not pro-Russia, it's pro-America and pro-Americans and pro our own American border. I'd like to talk about this feasibility study for creating a center of excellence in Ukraine by reminding the House today that there are approximately 40,000 homeless veterans in America today. These are men and women who served our country, served to defend our national security, but yet they are living homeless on the streets. Our National Defense Authorization Act should only fund the Department of Defense for the defense of our country. And again, I'll state the mission statement as stated on the Department of Defense website. The mission stands to deter war and to protect our nation's national security. By engaging in paying for a feasibility study of creating a center of excellence in Ukraine, that does not deter war, nor does that protect our national security interest. But I would like to talk about the people that we should care about, the people we should be spending our American tax dollars for. One of them is a man named Mike Reynolds. Mike lives in my district, and Mike is a veteran that served our country. Mike has a brain injury that he sustained serving the United States of America in our military. Mike did not get help from Veteran Affairs. Mike is not receiving help from a feasibility study in the Department of Defense funding and the NDAA. Mike had to establish his own way of helping himself by creating a very important, incredible organization to help other veterans who also don't receive help. It's called Hero Ag. You see, Mike is a farmer, and he learned to become a farmer because he found that farming was a way that he could heal not only his brain, but he could also heal the pain inside of him that he sustained from serving and fighting in another foreign war, not America's war. What Mike does now is he spends his time rehabbing other veterans who are also injured in all kinds of ways, some of them not visible from our own eyes because they're injuries inside their brains. Mike is a great American, and I'm so proud that he lives in my district, and I'm honored and always grateful to visit his farm and do anything I can to help Hero Ag and help the veterans that go there. But our National Defense Authorization Act should be funding for our Department of Defense for our nation's military. And that doesn't have anything to do with another nation. There's a lot of talk in the House today coming from both sides of the aisle, talking about what the NDAA is for. But too much of the time, I'm hearing it talk about a war in Ukraine. And again, I'll remind everyone here, the Ukraine is not the 51st state. Ukraine is another country and another land. And American lives are not being risked. They are not being killed in Ukraine because Ukraine, again, is not part of the United States of America. But our tax dollars come from America. They come from hardworking Americans. And they very much want their money only to be spent for the defense of our border, of our states, and of our national security interest. This is a feasibility study that should not be in our NDAA. This should be in a separate funding bill. Again, just like $300 million going to Ukraine should be in a separate funding bill because it doesn't make sense for the NDAA, this feasibility study for creating a center of excellence in Ukraine should be in a separate funding bill, and that would be the important way to handle it. Now, I'll ask the House today, is it our job to be the world's police? Is it our job to create feasibility studies on how to help injured people all over the world? Because while the NDAA has a proposed center of excellence for Ukraine, the NDAA does not have a proposed center of excellence for countries in Africa that have civil wars going on, where there are people there that are dealing with amputations or brain injuries. This doesn't have a feasibility study to help any other country but Ukraine. And again, I'll reiterate, Ukraine is not the United States of America. I reserve my time.
Thank you. Right. For what purpose does the gentleman from Connecticut seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On January 21st, 2021, I introduced articles of impeachment against Joe Biden. And less than 2 weeks later, I was kicked off all of my committees by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. They said it was for Facebook comments and replies and likes, but we all know the truth. It was because my articles of impeachment on Joe Biden were correct. He was indeed abusing his power as Vice President of the United States. Now we have more information to prove that not only was I right then, but it was more damning than we already knew. But I'd like to roll back. President Trump was wrongfully impeached twice. And both of these impeachments must be expunged by the House of Representatives. But what I'd like to talk about is the difference in the type of information we have. The Democrats brought out the Steele dossier. The Steele dossier was written as a Democrat political opposition research paper. The information was written by a contractor, and it was fed to the FBI with no transparency on subsources. The contractor had no primary source information, and the FBI operationalized uncorroborated claims to secure FISA warrant on political campaign official of opposing political party. Information was later debunked by Congress, the Inspector General, and Special Counsel investigations. But the mainstream media won Pulitzer Prizes on the bogus Russia narrative. And then they led the witch hunt, leading to impeaching President Trump over a phone call with the president of Ukraine. But let me tell the House what type of information we actually have. We have an FBI form called an FD 1023 form, and here's the difference for the public listening. On the 1023 form, the information originated from an FBI informant who'd been relied upon for many years and was considered the FBI's top informant. It was also paid $200,000 for multiple years by the FBI. Information was written by the FBI agent in official FBI form and relied on no additional subsources. The FBI informant was a direct eye and ear witness to the information provided. The FBI apparently took no action to further the investigative claim. The FBI has refused to describe any investigative steps to assess the investigative information. Therefore, it has not been debunked, despite White House's lies and false claims. The mainstream media has largely ignored the story or parroted the White House false claim. What does the FD 1023 form tell you? I'll tell you exactly what it says, because not only have I read it, I also have it in my possession right here. And this is a form that the entire American people, the entire public should have because it's unclassified. But Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, forced us to read it in a Schiff and would not hand it over to us. Thankfully, Senator Chuck Grassley released this form because it was provided to him by a brave whistleblower. This form entails the damning information that then Vice President Joe Biden took a $5 million bribe from the oligarch that owns Burisma. Not only did Joe Biden take a $5 million bribe, so did Hunter Biden. And what did Joe Biden deliver as Vice President of the United States? He got Viktor Shokin, the Ukrainian prosecutor general, fired from his job. How did Joe Biden, Vice President, get that done? He threatened to withhold $1 billion of U.S. aid to Ukraine until Viktor Shokin was fired. And you want to know what? He was fired. In 2016, Joe Biden himself bragged to the Foreign Council and told them that he got him fired. He bragged about it. It's on video. But that's not all they've done. Hunter Biden has also gotten his father on the phone over 24 times to talk with his business partners and talk with them about the business that they are doing. And even more so, in our possession, through our investigations on our Republican-led committees, we also have a WhatsApp chat that says, from Hunter Biden, I am sitting here with my father, and we would like to understand why the commitment made has not been fulfilled. Who's his father? Joe Biden. Tell the director that I would like to resolve this now before it gets out of hand, and now means tonight. And it continues on. What I'm demanding is that the Republican-led House of Representatives move forward on an impeachment inquiry on Joe Biden, because this type of corruption should never be allowed to stand. We must expunge President Trump's wrongful impeachments, and we must impeach Joe Biden.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in House Report number 118-158, offered by Ms. Greene of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 614, the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Greene, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to ask the House to support my amendment number 33, which will cut the $73 million increase in funding for the NATO Security Investment Program. This is simply keeping the NATO funding at the same level as last year's appropriations level. I think this is very important. The United States overwhelmingly contributes more than our fair share to NATO for Europe's defense, and it's time for European countries to pay their dues. While our own border is overrun by border crossers and deadly poisonous fentanyl daily, we continue to send hundreds of billions of dollars to NATO to defend Ukraine's democracy, even though they aren't even a NATO member nation. Investing in NATO security is an America Last policy. All increases in funding should be investing in the United States of America's security and the defense of our own border. President Trump was exactly right when he called on European nations to put the required minimum of 2% of their GDP towards NATO defense spending. Most NATO countries still don't meet that requirement, and the U.S. ends up paying for 70% of the alliance's defenses. This is outrageous. The American people do not like paying for other countries' defense when our borders are overrun daily. The current 2023 defense expenditure for NATO countries has the United States at $860 billion. The United States of America's military is not meant to be the world's police. And as we find ourselves funding a war in Ukraine, when the United States' position should be pushing for peace, not paying for and not funding war and death of innocent people, we should not increase our spending and increase the amount of funding by $73 million more dollars to the NATO Security Investment Program. Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. Who claims time in opposition?
Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from
I
Texas
claim time
seek?
in opposition.
The gentleman's recognized.
My arguments are the same. NATO Security Investment Program is NATO's military construction program. The $73 million increase this year is needed to reinvest infrastructure in the region to deter Russian aggression. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I reserve my time.
Gentleman,
sorry. I yield my time. I yield 2 minutes to Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
I thank the gentleman for yielding.
The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in opposition to this grossly irresponsible amendment. This amendment would take a huge cut, $73 million, from the NATO Security Investment Program during a time when increased funding is essential for long-deferred projects. Cutting funding for the NATO Security Investment Program is not only short-sighted from a national security perspective, but it isn't even sound long-term fiscal policy. These investments ensure a robust American and NATO presence to deter hostile nations and prevent even greater costs to American taxpayers down the road. And one has only to look at the news to understand that we have hostile nations who wish to do us and our allies harm. And a $73 million cut from the NATO Security Investment Program would put us more in jeopardy alongside our allies. The Russian invasion of Ukraine shows that international cooperation and strong alliances are as essential as ever. These projects are not America paying other countries' bills. In fact, America pays a proportionally small amount to the program compared to the size of our economy in relation to the rest of NATO. Regardless of your stance on overall defense spending levels of various NATO countries, it's simply not true that the United States is paying more than its share of this direct contribution program. These projects are agreed upon NATO requirements and oftentimes have a direct benefit to supplement existing U.S. requirements. These sites include ones directly benefiting U.S. forces through the use of upgraded ports, airfields, and communications. Our contributions to NATO represent only a small portion of overall defense spending, but the strength of the alliance is an outsized and irreplaceable part of American national security. This amendment would not even reinvest the funding into other priorities. It simply cuts funding from the bill, shortchanging the military construction portion of the bill by over $73 million. It's irresponsible, it's dangerous, and I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. I yield back to the gentleman.
The gentleman from Texas.
At this time, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I thank my friend and I thank the chair. Americans are not fighting and dying in Ukraine. Ukrainians are. And all they ask of the great country they admire and they want to emulate is that we help with equipment and training. Putin benefits from this amendment. Putin, a sociopath who is engaged in the most depraved behavior in our lifetimes, killing innocent men and women, targeting hospitals, targeting schools, showing no restraint. This Congress must stand with Ukraine. This Congress can never be seen as Putin's enabler And that is what this amendment does. That's what's behind it. The author of this amendment has already said she wants to give zero to Ukraine. So we know the motivation behind the amendment. Let's reject it. Let's stand with Ukraine, and let's make sure Putin gets that message loud and strong with a forceful vote here on the floor of the House of Representatives. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose? The gentleman from Texas. Rise.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps my colleagues are confused. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Ukraine has not been accepted into NATO. So why are they using defense of Ukraine for their argument for an additional $73 million increase for the NATO Security Investment Program? That absolutely makes no sense. And if you want to talk about national security, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about the American people's national security. My colleague across the aisle speaks of hostile nations and how they present a clear danger to America's national security. Well, you have to look no further than the southern border. The southern border is where hostile nations are invading our country every single day with poisonous fentanyl, which is murdering over 300 Americans a day. If there's going to be an increase in funding for the defense of any nation, it should be the United States of America's border in defense of American lives. And I would like to add on, Mr. Speaker, my position and the position of most Americans is peace, not funding the murder and death and continued foreign wars, defending other countries' democracies while completely ignoring our own. I ask the House to pass my amendment that keeps the spending level at the same level it was this previous appropriations bill, the same level. An increase in $73 million is another step towards funding World War III. It's another step in United States aggression over a country that is not even a member of NATO in the name of a NATO Security Investment Program. This is absolute madness. It's outrageous, and I reserve.
The gentlelady reserves.
The gentlelady has the only time remaining. The gentleman from Georgia has the only time remaining.
Yeah. Gentlelady from Georgia reserved. Do you have any time remaining?
How much time do I have remaining? 1 minute. 1 minute. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll just wrap this up. It's very simple. We're at $32 trillion in debt. There's no need to increase spending over the level that it was last year. Americans are already spending $860 billion for NATO, for the defense of other nations. There's no reason to increase it by $73 million more dollars. My amendment's very simple. It's just asking to keep the appropriation level the same as it was this past year. I ask the House to support my amendment. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 1435, the Preserving Choice in Vehicle Purchases Act. Democrats' radical Green New Deal agenda is once again being forced on the American people. This comes on the heels after the Biden administration has sold 40% of our oil reserves and none have been replenished, endangering our national security. They passed the Green New Deal in multiple bills, the infrastructure bill, to build 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations in the U.S., even though there is no mass demand for electric vehicles. They're also forcing Americans to go net zero by 2035, a date that our current president will unlikely ever even see. Forcing Americans to have no choice in the type of automobile that they drive, on the type of engine that they prefer, is forcing every American's knee to bend to China, our worst enemy. This is traitorous to auto workers, traitorous to auto unions, and traitorous to every American auto consumer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Greene of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Greene, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment will prohibit funding for the Uniting for Ukraine program. This is a streamlined categorical parole process that allows an unlimited number of illegal aliens into our country from Ukraine. There have been over 9 million illegal aliens who have invaded our country since Joe Biden took office. It's unprecedented. Just last month, over 300,000 illegals invaded our country, the most ever recorded in a single month. Over this past weekend, Border Patrol reported there were over 11,000 illegal alien encounters in just a 24-hour period. I deeply sympathize with the innocent people in Ukraine, especially since our government is forcing a proxy war there by funding and fueling a war instead of pushing peace in this country. However, America is facing our own war at our southern border, and we cannot stand to address every global crisis when our own house is not in order, yet safe. We cannot afford to violate our own immigration laws on behalf of a global crisis, especially a global crisis that the United States government is fueling and funding. The United States is fueling the war in Ukraine by sending tanks, ammunition, F-16s, and over $113 billion taxpayer dollars and counting, especially when the debate in Washington and the argument is about more money for Ukraine. The Uniting for Ukraine process grants mass categorical parole to these individuals, which is a complete violation of our own immigration laws. Parole is to be granted on a case-by-case basis as required by the law. Although many claim this specific process is granting parole on a case-by-case basis, based on a proven track record, this administration doesn't even know what case-by-case means. They just know mass migration into the United States. Joe Biden and Secretary Mayorkas continue to abuse our immigration laws and grant categorical parole for illegal aliens into our country. Secretary Mayorkas has already granted temporary legal status to 75,000 Ukrainians under the temporary protected status designation, which includes benefits such as work permits, social security numbers, and driver's license. This Uniting for Ukraine process has no numerical cap, which means an unlimited number of illegal aliens from Ukraine can come and displace American workers. Our country needs to put American citizens first for once. We need to win the war at the southern border that the Mexican cartels are waging on our country before granting parole to an unlimited number of individuals and allow them to remain here for an indefinite amount of time. Mr. Chair, I reserve.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in strong opposition that prohibits funding for Uniting for Ukraine program. In life, we have to make a decision. Either we're for good or for evil. Either we're for democracy or we're for dictatorships. And this Uniting for Ukraine program allows Ukrainians that are displaced by the Russian invasion of Ukraine to apply to come to the U.S. through humanitarian parole. This amendment seeks to stop a program that blocks thousands of Ukrainians from entering the country. It plays in the hands of Russia. Russia, here again, an attempt to cut any support for Ukraine as they fight to defend the country from an illegal Russian invasion. Putin is attempting to rewrite the map of Europe through the use of force. He's doing so in violation of international law, is deliberately killing civilians, destroying the economic livelihood of Ukraine, and taking kids from Ukraine over, stealing the kids over and taking them to Russia. War crimes are being committed on a mass scale, and the United States and the democratic nations of the world must continue to strongly oppose him. And again, I remind members, this bill passed on June 21st, 2023. Here we are at 9:40 p.m., and we're going to be here till about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't mind working. My parents were migrant workers, and they worked hard. So we can work, and we'll stay here to whatever time. But the point I'm trying to make is that instead of looking at this bill on June 22nd, 2023, here we are a few days before the shutdown. And again, I remind, the last 5 shutdowns have been by Republican-controlled houses. This Saturday or this Sunday at 12:01, we will see probably the 6th Republican-controlled shutdown that we have. Again, we want to work with you. I want to work with my good friend who's always in a good mood, Mr. Joyce again. I want to work with him on this. But again, you can't say we're the majority, you're in the minority, you're not going to have a say-so. Some of us don't just go visit the border. We actually live there. I work with the Border Patrol. I want to support them. And then I keep in mind, again, I want to remind members that we had an opportunity to put $2.4 billion, which we did add, to support Border Patrol, control the border. And guess what? Except for 2 Republicans that are still in the House of Representatives voted against border security. So again, we have a choice. It's either good or evil, either a dictatorship or democracy. I stand for good, and I stand for democracy, and I ask members to vote against this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Chair, how much remaining time do I have?
The gentlewoman has 1 3/4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I'll remind the House and the American people watching at home, Democrats aren't worried about shutdowns. They love shutdowns. They shut down America for almost 2 years. People are still suffering from the Democratic communist shutdowns. I don't know why they keep complaining about it, because they're the party that forced it on the American people, while they're complaining about it for themselves. That is so pathetic. Everyone in here gets a taxpayer-funded paycheck. So don't whine about shutdowns when you shut down America on the very people that paid your salary. But let's talk about allowing an unlimited number of Ukrainians into the country on the American taxpayer dime. This war is not supported by American taxpayers, not Americans. Over 55% of Americans do not want to fund it anymore. And we want to talk about funding Border Patrol agents. Let's talk about funding Border Patrol so they can secure our border, not be the welcoming committee to the entire world for the United States of America. Mr. Chair, I ask the House to pass my amendment, and I yield.
The gentlewoman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Georgia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 55, printed in Part B of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 55, printed in Part B of House Report number 118-216.
From Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, I'd like to introduce an amendment that uses the Holman Rule to slash the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin's salary to no more than $1, and $1 is too much money. Let's talk about the job description of the Secretary of Defense. That role oversees the Defense Department and acts as the principal defense policymaker and advisor to the President of the United States. The Department of Defense's mission statement states that with our military tracing its roots back to pre-revolutionary times, the department has grown and evolved with our nation. Our mission is to provide the military forces needed to deter war and ensure our nation's security. Secretary Austin has not fulfilled his job duties. As a matter of fact, he's destroying our military. During Secretary Austin's tenure, military recruitment has reached crisis levels of low recruitment. The numbers show that the Army expects to fall 15,000 recruits short of its annual recruiting goal this year. The Navy is expecting to be short 10,000 recruits. The Air Force is down another 3,000. This cannot stand, especially with our government funding and fueling a war in Ukraine that is leading us undoubtedly to World War III. Secretary Lloyd Austin failed America with his withdrawal from Afghanistan, making American forces leave in retreat and feeling like failure. Secretary Austin also forced more than 8,000 troops to be kicked out of the military for refusing the COVID vaccine. My amendment is a strong amendment, and many Americans agree. We do not want the United States military led by failure, causing us to be weak. We need to pass my amendment. Madam Chair, I reserve.
The gentlewoman from Georgia reserves. No. The gentlewoman.
I reserve.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I rise in opposition to this amendment.
The gentlewoman's recognized for 5 minutes.
And we've seen several of these amendments, so I think, Madam Chair, you know how disappointed I am that these types of amendments have been proposed by the majority, but especially this one. Secretary Austin has dedicated his life to service in the United States. For 41 years, he served in the United States Army, which began as an appointment to West Point and rose to the rank of 4-star general. He served as the 33rd Vice Chair of the Staff of the Army and completed his career as the head of Central Command. Secretary Austin was awarded the Silver Star for his leadership in the Army's 3rd Infantry Division during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. He didn't have to return to service for the nation after giving 41 years of his life, but when called by President Biden, he served again. You may disagree with the administration's policies, as well as we've done over our careers with different administrations, but Secretary Austin has done nothing to merit this amendment. While taking upon the job as Secretary of Defense, Secretary Austin has outlined his priorities for himself and the department. First, defend the nation, which included prioritizing China as a pacing threat and address advanced and persistent threats. Second, take care of our people, to include growing our talent, building our resilience and our readiness, and ensuring accountable leadership. And third and finally, succeed through teamwork. Focus on working with allies and partners, building unity within the department. Each one of these principles should be policies and qualities that we support in our Secretary of Defense, no matter what administration he or she serves in. Secretary Austin has worked tirelessly to ensure that our allies and partners remain united. Secretary Austin has personally pulled together the ministers of defense from all over NATO to mount an unprecedented coordination of equipment, training, and tools that the Ukrainians need to fight Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion. Upon taking office, our relationship with the Philippines was at an all-time low. Secretary Austin reaffirmed our visiting forces agreement, which led to the creation of rotational access to 9 total locations, strengthening our defense in the critical Indo-Pacific area. He has made historic breakthroughs through our cooperation with Japan, leading to Japan updating their national strategy documents, which increases security burden sharing in the region with a key ally. He has worked to cement the principles of a trilateral security pact between Australia, the UK, and the United States. And that helps us with our U.S. military position in the Pacific. He's introduced programs that will help our military personnel, for example. As pointed out, recruitment's at an all-time low, but it's not because of anything that Secretary Austin did. Here's what he's doing to keep the retention and to attract people in. Introducing universal pre-K, which will cut daycare costs for our military men and women. Instituting increases in basic allowance for housing for active duty service members in 28 military housing areas that have experienced an average cost of more than 20% spike in rental housing costs. Expanding military spouse employment opportunities, strengthening support to our families, and cutting the cost of food at commissaries. Each one of these efforts help retain our servicemen and women to our service to our nation. There, of course, is more work to do, and there always is. But Secretary Austin is making the effort, and there's no need for us to make such a personal, drastic attack by eliminating his pay. For these reasons, I ask you and my fellow colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota reserves. The gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized.
Madam Chair, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to Congressman Van Orden, who has also proudly served in the United States military.
Congressman Van Orden is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Chair, I have multiple combat tours as a Navy SEAL, including 2 to Afghanistan, and that is why I rise today in support of the amendment to use the Holman Rule to reduce the Secretary Austin's salary to $1. To paraphrase a famous British officer's evaluation, Secretary Austin consistently sets low standards and then fails to meet them. Secretary Austin remains in charge of the Pentagon, despite the fact that he's been responsible for the greatest degradation in the United States military since the Vietnam War and the highest active duty and veteran suicide rate in our history. He's directly responsible for abandoning thousands of American citizens and our allies to terrorists in Afghanistan and the subsequent deaths of 13 of our brave men and women in uniform during that fiasco. I support applying the Holman Rule to reduce the salary to $1 simply because we cannot reduce it to 0. Secretary Austin could save further controversy and redeem his honor by resigning immediately and publicly apologizing to all of the Gold Star families he is directly responsible for creating at the bombing of Abbey Gate. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Georgia reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized. The gentlewoman from Minnesota has 1 minute remaining.
Thank you. I'll be brief. The loss of our veterans to suicide is tragic, and coming from a family with many who have served, I am going to reunions, military reunions. I know how serious this issue is. But to put this on Secretary Austin, to me, is just wrong. And it's disrespectful. Because I've had these conversations with him personally about this. And I just want to remind members that the Trump administration started the immediate, quick, pass-phased withdrawal out of Afghanistan. And when President Biden came into office, he knew we were at a critical juncture to try to get people out safely. He was able to negotiate a small extension, but that was it. And so it's a shared responsibility for what happened in Afghanistan. Maybe the administration could have planned it better, but the administration's hand, the Biden's administration's hand was forced by what the Trump administration had put into action.
The gentlewoman's
With that, I yield back.
time has expired. The gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized.
There is no excuse. You can't blame President Trump for the failure in Afghanistan. That failure lies on Secretary Lloyd Austin, Joe Biden, the President of the United States, and his administration. President Trump would have never led our troops to failure in Afghanistan, would have never abandoned $7 billion worth of military equipment, and President Trump would have never left the Afghan people in complete ruin and be controlled by a terrorist government, the Taliban. That is a complete excuse. Democrats need to stop blaming President Trump and his administration for Joe Biden's failures. I urge the House to adopt my amendment, Madam Chair, to take Secretary Lloyd Austin's salary using the Holman Rule, which is a rule that allows us to fire failures that are serving our government and serving our country. Lloyd Austin is not serving the United States military. Lloyd Austin is leading it into failure. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield.
The gentlewoman from Georgia yields back the balance of her time. The questions.
Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 41, printed in Part D of House Report number 118-216, offered by Ms. Greene of Georgia.
Unanimous consent to withdraw amendment number 41.
Without objection. March with 42. It is now in order to consider amendment number 42, printed in Part D of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 42, printed in Part D of House Report number 118-216, offered by Ms. Greene of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Greene, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment would prohibit funds from being provided to assist Ukraine. Over a year and a half ago, Russia invaded Ukraine, but now the United States has basically taken over Ukraine and is fighting a proxy war in Ukraine that we never voted for. We are funding their government. We are paying for their small businesses. We are paying their farmers. We are handing military equipment and weapons over to Ukraine and paying for their war. According to the Congressional Research Service, in 2022, the United States provided $113 billion in total assistance to Ukraine. Every single year, the United States spends billions of dollars on foreign aid, much more than any other country. Ukraine has now taken the top spot. The $50 billion state and foreign operations bill includes an unspecified funding amount for Ukraine. Section 7046B2 would make funds available for Ukraine to support the ability of the government of Ukraine to defend their sovereignty and withstand the impacts of Russia's invasion, combat corruption, and promote transparency and democracy. This is nothing more than a blank check for Ukraine that Joe Biden's State Department will get to write. And even more dangerously, they get to waive oversight, claiming national security. All this will do is fuel another never-ending war and push the United States even closer to the brink of nuclear holocaust. After Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan wars, haven't we had enough of taxpayer-funded state and foreign operations? They tell us we have to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here. But paying for wars in foreign countries will eventually have consequences on our country. And we will bring the war to America, and we will end up fighting them here when countries have had enough of the United States. After a year and a half of being engaged in this conflict, the American people no longer support the additional assistance to Ukraine. My amendment will help stop this brutal war and help push for peace in Ukraine, which should be our ultimate goal. Mr. Chair, I reserve.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition? I'm sorry, Georgia reserves. For what purpose, Ms. Lee, do you seek recognition?
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Russia's brutal and unprovoked attack on Ukraine is not just a threat to Ukraine and its neighbors, but to the world. If Russia succeeds in its aggression, other unprovoked attacks are inevitable. As my colleague Representative Hoyer said last week on the House floor, we are locked in a struggle between freedom and fascism, democracy and despotism, might and right. The war in Ukraine is that struggle manifest. Ukraine's democracy is being undermined every single day. Entire cities have been demolished. Women and girls are being sexually abused by Russian soldiers. Hospitals and schools, which should be safe havens, are being intentionally attacked. Thousands of innocent children and their families have been brutally murdered. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to flee their country. Colleagues, we must continue to ensure that Ukraine has the funding and support it needs to defend itself, and that vulnerable people continue to receive life-saving assistance. And I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. The gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to yield 1 minute to my friend from Illinois, Congresswoman Miller.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Congresswoman Greene. Joe Biden has forced Americans to foot the bill for hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine, while our southern border is being invaded by terrorists, drug cartels, gangs, and human traffickers. I oppose sending any additional money to Ukraine oligarchs in a proxy war that we are being dragged into because Ukraine was paying the Biden family $1 million a year in cash. Americans deserve a spending bill that puts America first by securing our border and putting us back on the path to energy independence, which was achieved by the Trump administration. I want to thank Congresswoman Greene for offering this amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 1.5 minutes now to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sadly, the world is in a conflict we did not choose between dictators with rule of gun opposing democracies with rule of law. War criminal Putin began the current murderous conflict invading Ukraine, shocked to find out that Ukrainians courageously resisted. The brave Ukrainian people are an inspiration to the world, as they know Putin falsely claims Ukraine does not exist, as Putin is trying to reassemble the evil empire of the Soviet Union. Fellow dictators clearly see the conflict as dictator of democracy as North Korean Kim Jong-un joins Putin. The Chinese Communist Party is conducting the largest peacetime military buildup in world history. The regime in Tehran builds drones for Putin to murder Ukrainian civilians as they plan death to America, death to Israel. We must stop the dictators today, or there will be a direct threat to American families tomorrow. We must always remember, of all things, Pearl Harbor. We must remember 9/11. For these reasons, I oppose the amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman, I believe, yields back.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It needs to be recognized that we represent the American people. And the polling shows very clearly the American people do not support continuing to fund a war in a foreign country when our own country has been having a war waged on us by the Mexican cartels. 55% of Americans say the U.S. Congress should not authorize additional funding to Ukraine. 51% say the U.S. has already done enough to help Ukraine. Americans demand their hard-earned tax dollars be used to secure our own southern border and stop the Mexican cartel's war on America that's killing 300 Americans every single day, that's human trafficking, sex trafficking. You want to talk about women and children? We should care about the women and children that are being trafficked at our own southern border, not pay to defend another foreign country and worry about another country who, by the way, is not the 51st state. We only have 50 states in the United States of America, and our tax dollars should pay to defend our states here. I urge the House to adopt my amendment, and that, Mr. Chair, I yield the rest of my time.
The gentlewoman from Georgia yields.
I yield, Mr. Chairman, I yield the remaining time to my remaining time to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Speaker, when Ronald Reagan stood in front of the Berlin Wall and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, take down this wall," he did so not because we were in opposition to just the Soviet Union and Russians. He did so because we were in opposition to authoritarianism. We were in opposition to communism. Now, that wall fell, but it didn't fall because the Soviet Union took it down. It fell because they merely didn't shoot the people who were doing so. But when it fell, as a result of Ronald Reagan's words and a call to the world, the line between authoritarianism and democracy marched all the way to the border of Russia. Right now, today, Putin has told us straight up he wants to move the line of authoritarianism back. He wants to reclaim that land, not just Ukraine, but Poland, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, Eastern Europe, and the Baltics. We must support democracy or freedom, or yes, if we don't, ours is at risk. Ronald Reagan's words are meaningless if we allow Russia to reestablish authoritarianism and move that line of democracy back to where the Soviet Union had claimed Eastern Europe and had imposed authoritarianism on people's lives. Now, this is not just an American mission. The world is with us. Democracies are with us. This is a chart that shows the amount of contribution of the total aggregate of all aid. This is up on my website, by the way, my official website. If you go there and click on Ukraine, you'll see these, along with a report that verifies this information. The United States is not the major contributor of total aid. But what's more important, when you get to military aid, the United States is less than half of all military aid. The world's democracies are standing against Russia for democracy, against authoritarianism, and the United States, the light of the world for democracy, needs to be there and needs to support the Ukrainian people against these atrocities. If you go to my website, you'll see the documentation that supports this. We are $42 billion. The rest of our democracy allies are over $50 billion. We need to stay in the fight by supplying Ukrainians the weapons that they need for them to be in the fight for democracy. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise as a designee of the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Granger, and I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, first, something that has to be recognized on this floor is my colleague from Georgia who's presenting this amendment has been transparent, open, and clear from day one. And that is something that is not always seen in this body, and I think we need to recognize that. And I think that's something that has to be respected, regardless of if one agrees or disagrees with her. And I think that's something that has to be recognized. Now, I just want to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the bill. I clearly recognize my colleagues, and it's not only her, frustration about the administration's lack of transparency, lack of articulation, lack of a strategy, how the funds have been used, on the communication from A to Z. I get that. And so while there are no funds directed for the Ukraine in this bill, there are a lot of directives in this bill for accountability for any assistance going to Ukraine. And let me just take a moment to read the list of requirements that must be completed before one single penny would be used to go to Ukraine from this bill. A strategy, and this is now or later or whenever, a strategy within 90 days. We've not gotten that from the administration. In-person monitoring of all programs. Cost matching requirements, making sure that other donors must do more than the United States before one penny can go out. A certification that comprehensive oversight mechanisms are in place, a notification to Congress so we can assess if any of how those funds may be used, an obligation report every 90 days accounting for all monies provided, an oversight report every 90 days detailing any allegations of waste, fraud, and corruption and how those will be addressed. And finally, and I think this is key, all reports must be clearly posted on the internet so that every American can look where their taxpayer money is going. So the reason that I am so optimistic and so gung-ho about this bill is that we need to pass this bill in order to have requirements, these requirements in order to not have a blank check. I am looking at not only the short term but also long term. We need to have accountability. We need conditions. We need oversight. We need to take away as much flexibility from the administration. That's precisely what we are attempting to do in this bill. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida yields back.
Oklahoma reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the comments from my good friend from Oklahoma, who he knows I have great affection for him, but I'm dizzy from all the spin, quite frankly. First let me just say about the CR, what we know is that what may or may not pass in the House, based on the fact that the Freedom Caucus seems to be calling the shots, will never pass the Senate. So we know whatever is going to come out of the Rules Committee in the next 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever, if anything, will ever be able to get the votes, not just amongst Democrats, but amongst Republicans in the Senate. Secondly, we do know that the Senate is working in a bipartisan way. They already have cloture to move forward with the process to bring up a CR, an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote. But we know what they pass would pass this House if put on the floor. And the reason why this government will in all likelihood shut down is because the Speaker of the House is so beholden to a small group of the most extreme members that he won't put that on the floor. He will rig it so that we do not have a chance to be able to vote on it. That's how this government will shut down. Secondly, my good friend talks about how this is really no big deal. It's just another vote, and everybody should be happy. But let me ask, if this were good for Ukraine and Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia's illegal war, then why would members of the pro-Putin caucus even agree to this? If everyone genuinely thought there was no difference between keeping the funding in the defense bill and moving it separately, why insist on all of this? The answer is really simple. Republicans who seem to be enamored with Putin want this funding sent separately to the Senate because they know that's their best shot to prevent this money from going to Ukraine at all. In fact, when Marjorie Taylor Greene left the Republican conference meeting this morning, and I quoted it already, but I'll quote it again, she said, "We're not funding Ukraine, period." That's what I heard in there, end quote. And we all know that there are senators like Rand Paul and Tommy Tuberville who will block a separate Ukraine funding bill from moving forward. I mean, they're actively preventing the Senate from completing its work as we speak. This is not a flaw in the sidecar plan. It's a main feature and a goal. So let's be clear. This funding that we're talking about here is long-standing security assistance. It has been in the defense bill for years, even before Putin invaded Ukraine. This is not the supplemental funding that President Zelensky requested when he met with Speaker McCarthy last week. This is not the supplemental funding the administration requested in their emergency funding request, and it is not the supplemental funding that the Senate is trying to put in their bipartisan CR. So spare me the argument that somehow this is a good thing and it gives everybody a chance for their voice to be heard on this topic. If everybody wanted their voice to be heard on this topic, you would have speaker after speaker after speaker right now speaking on this bill and speaking about their concerns about our Ukraine policy. There's no one over there. Let's all be real here about what's happening. And the House already had its voice heard, and it overwhelmingly voted to support funding in the defense bill, a 3/4 majority. You can't get that many people to agree on lunch in this place. And it's a majority of your majority. The pro-Putin extremists didn't like the outcome, so they talked to the Speaker into rigging the vote. That is what this is all about. And Mr. Speaker, so I am here to offer the House the opportunity to demonstrate for a third time that we stand by Ukraine in their time of need. And I urge that we defeat the previous question. And if we do, I will offer an amendment that would strike the provision of the rule eliminating security assistance funding for Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment into the record along with any extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 2A1 of Rule 9, I seek recognition to give notice of my intent to raise a question of the privileges of the House. The form of the resolution is as follows. A resolution censuring Representative Rashida Tlaib for anti-Semitic activity, sympathizing with terrorist organizations, and leading an insurrection at the United States Capitol complex. Whereas in May 2019, Rashida Tlaib said that she celebrated the Holocaust and felt a calming feeling when thinking about the genocide of millions of Jews. Whereas in 2020, Rashida Tlaib retweeted an illustration with the caption, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And this Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO slogan, has been adopted by Hamas and calls for the elimination of Israel and death to all Jews. Whereas in September 2022, Rashida Tlaib, as a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, displayed her disdain for Israel, saying, "You cannot claim to hold progressive values, yet back Israel's apartheid government." Whereas instead of denouncing the horrors of Hamas, slaughtering Israelis, and demanding the release of all hostages held by Hamas, Rashida Tlaib stated on October 8, 2023, The path to the future must include lifting the blockade, ending the occupation, and dismantling the apartheid system that creates the suffocating, dehumanizing conditions that can lead to resistance. Whereas Rashida Tlaib exhibited her hatred for America by reposting a message on October 12, 2023, blaming America for allowing the deaths of Palestinian babies at the hands of Israel. Whereas Rashida Tlaib led an insurrection at the United States Capitol complex on October 18, 2023, which put members of Congress, their staffs, and Capitol visitors in danger by shutting down elevators, stairwells, and points of egress while obstructing official business in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, including a Senate Foreign Affairs Committee hearing. Whereas the insurrection led by Rashida Tlaib was organized by Jewish Voice for Peace, which the Anti-Defamation League calls a radical anti-Israel activist group that advocates for a complete economic, cultural, and academic boycott of the State of Israel, and that believes Israeli policies and actions are motivated by deeply rooted Jewish racial chauvinism and religious supremacism. Whereas members of the Southern Poverty Law Center, a far-left nonprofit organization, were present at the insurrection at the Capitol on October 18, 2023. Whereas several insurrectionists at the Capitol belong to a group messaging chat called Global Intifada, which is the Arabic word for rebellion or uprising, and refers to a series of protests and violent riots carried out by Palestinians in Israel during the last century. Whereas by leading an anti-American and anti-Semitic insurrection on October 18, 2023, Rashida Tlaib followed Hezbollah's orders to carry out a day of unprecedented anger following an explosion at a Gazan hospital, lying about Israel's responsibility for the attack, which United States intelligence agencies said was not perpetrated by Israel. And whereas members of Congress who denounce the United States while praising terrorist organizations are unfit to hold office, now therefore be it resolved that Representative Rashida Tlaib be censured. Representative Rashida Tlaib forthwith present herself in the well of the House of Representatives for the pronouncement of censure, and Representative Rashida Tlaib be censured with the public reading of this resolution by the Speaker. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm here to inform the House of Representatives that the Oversight Committee has indeed brought forward the receipts in our impeachment inquiry of Joe Biden. Through our investigation, we have uncovered a check to Joe Biden for $200,000. This comes from foreign funds from a country in the Middle East through a struggling company, and you can see the check is directly made to Joe Biden. This is what money laundering looks like. We've also uncovered and released today another check to Joseph R. Biden for $40,000. This $40,000 is a check written to him by his brother and sister-in-law, Sarah and James Biden, and this check comes from funds directly through money laundering through the CCP. No president of the United States, no vice president, no office holder should ever engage in money laundering, receiving money, selling out their office, selling out their power.
The gentlewoman's time has
expired. And getting paid from foreign countries.
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
Inquiry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Members are reminded